Please join us for our third annual Leadership Circle Summit at Cognia's corporate headquarters in Alpharetta, Georgia, January 13th through the 15th, 2025. Learn pragmatic solutions from our expert keynote speakers, Amanda Ripley, AJ Crabble, and Cognia's own president and CEO, Dr. Mark Elgart. Connect with other educational leaders to identify simple solutions to complex problems, share governance challenges, and establish critical professional networks that best support your work. Find out more about Cognia's Leadership Circle Summit at cognia.org or email us at leadershipcircle@cognia.org.
Ladies and gentlemen, educators, leaders, welcome to Leader Chat. I'm Jeff Rose, and as always, I'm excited. And let me rewind and tell those listening and watching why that is the case. It's because I learn so much. We are very strategic in who we want to learn from, and I find the guests that we're having, not just because of the content they bring, but their experience and their wisdom. Every single week, I just feel like my bucket is being filled as a learner. And so our strategy, our goal is to take this learning and make it digestible and pragmatic for members of the Leadership Circle and beyond, Leaders Nation and beyond wide. And we are thrilled for today. Today, the topic and our focus that we were looking at is leadership advocacy and strategic networks. Our listeners know that we're big into networks. We say circles are better than rows. We believe in leaders helping leaders. And we found the perfect guest for this discourse. We're going to be talking with Dr. Julia Rafal-Baer. And Rafal-Baer, after beginning her career as a special education teacher in the Bronx 2 decades ago, Julie is now a top educational advisor who leads high-performance, high-impact organizations nationwide. She's a trusted confidant to the nation's most effective state educational leaders and superintendents, directly coaching more than 75 leaders into the superintendent positions and state commissioner roles. 80% are leaders of color and 65% are women. Dr. Rafal-Baer frequently speaks and writes on the need to advocate more for women leaders in senior roles. Julie is the co-founder and CEO of ILO Group, a woman-founded leadership-focused educational policy and strategy firm. She's also the founder and CEO of Women Leading Ed, a national network of women educational leaders, and co-founder and partner at the Forum for Educational Leadership. Previously, she served as the Chief Operating Officer at Chiefs for Change, a nationwide network of district and state educational leaders. Julia served as an Assistant Commissioner of the New York State Education Department under Commissioner John B. King Jr., where she was responsible for the strategy, management, and implementation of teacher and leader initiatives, overseeing more than $150 million in federal funds. And here's the thing about Julia. The bio goes on. I mean, so there are many, many other impressive things as it relates to her career and trajectory in terms of what she's doing now in comparison to where she started. But I'm going to pause and just invite her to the screen, and we're going to dive in. So without further ado, I just want to say, Julie, thank you so much for this discussion. I've been looking forward to it since the first time we chatted. So let's just start with, how are you? And welcome.
Well, I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me on. I'm really excited about today's conversation.
Well, and I clearly, as you know, I kind of chopped off a lot of different things that you've done in your career. So maybe you can help our audience. I mean, we've had a chance to talk, just get to know you a little bit about, your experiences, and maybe right now, what has led to kind of your current and past and future why. I mean, what do you find as though kind of the thing that gets you up, and things that, you used to probably think about when you're sleeping?
Well, that is a heavy question. Look, I think, Jeff, I've just been so incredibly fortunate with my career path. I am not the person that As I think about who I was as a kid and my own struggles in education, I never could have imagined the kind of career path that I've had. School was an incredibly hard place for me. I'm somebody who identifies as having non-visible disabilities. And I spent more time in school in detentions and suspensions. I was kicked out of a school. I mean, it was rough. But the thing that saved me was that I was a competitive figure skater. And I was really good. And skating helped me to find a place to really focus my energy and to really think about how to set really strong goals, how to really train my body, my mind, my emotions. And it was because of skating that I was able to get into college. And when I got to college, everything changed. I got connected to the Office of Disability Support Services. And with the kinds of supports that I had there, my entire academic experience transformed. Suddenly I became this straight A student, and suddenly I was graduating early and taking graduate courses. It was just wild how different it was once I was able to get the kind of supports that I needed. And I'm highly disciplined, and figure skating really established that sense of drive and commitment and goal setting for me. After, though, my college experience and sort of towards the end, I learned about Teach for America. And I was pretty blown away by what Teach for America was trying to do and how to think about how to bring really excited new energy into the teaching workforce. I wanted to become a special education teacher because I wanted to better support kids who had been like me and so many other kids that really needed great teachers in front of them. When I got into teaching, though, I discovered what so many teachers discover, this incredible disconnect between the way in which sanctioned policies end up trickling down into your classroom. I had this experience when I was teaching. I was teaching a third and fourth grade inclusion. And when I started teaching, not only did I not have my students' IEPs, kids weren't getting their legally mandated services, but one of my students who was awaiting placement in a psychiatric treatment home ended up physically assaulting me. And I was told by my principal that her hands were tied as I sat in the hospital after this assault, and that the only next step was to file a police report. And Jeff, I just thought that was crazy. Like, how could we have a system where the next step for a student who's not getting their services is that a teacher is going to file a police report? So I decided to not do that. I decided instead to write a very passionate email to Joel Klein, who at the time was the chancellor of New York City Public Schools. Here I am, this random first-year teacher in the Bronx, writing to Joel Klein. And here's the craziest part. He responded to that email in 10 minutes. He thanked me for my service. He put all these people to work. And by the very next day, my student suddenly was getting his placement, and suddenly all of my students started getting their legally mandated services. And so I had this moment that was incredibly transformative for me. Not only my own experiences as a student with disabilities, my own experiences of the transformation of having the supports that I needed, but then suddenly understanding what teacher voice and teacher advocacy is really about. And the power of having a superintendent, a chancellor like Joel Klein, who would actually take the time to answer a new teacher's email in essentially late night hours and then do something about it was so powerful to me. And so my why became, how do you find more leaders like Joel Klein? My why became, how do you make sure that every student is seen and heard and getting the supports that they are both legally mandated to and also that they need in order to thrive and to be successful? And for me, so much of that is about policy. How do we get well-intentioned policy and the funding that's supposed to go with it into classrooms, to teachers, to let them do the things that they know how to do best for students? And that's what I've been building a career around for the last 2 decades.
So we have a dilemma here, Julia, because you and I, when we were talking previous to this show, kind of planning out this discussion, I did not know that part about your background. And so this is the dilemma, is that I'm internally shaking my head up and down because we have some similarities. So growing up in school, I was one who was sent to the resource room for every single day, for certain times of the day, something you might imagine I appreciated, but I did not. Huge issues. I really, really struggled in school, barely graduated from high school, but because of my sport, I was recruited into college and had some choices. I probably didn't have any right to go to certain schools that I was asked to come to, but I made that decision only because of my sport. But because of that, I did have discipline, and there was somebody in college, a professor, who recognized something in me that I had never recognized because I hated school and I thought I was definitely below average intelligence. And he taught me otherwise, and that was my moment. And from there, I thought, I don't even know if I like kids, but I think I need to look at education. There's something about that. And then that changed my focus. And it really hasn't changed other than becoming a teacher, a leader taking me under his wing and said, you're a leader, you need to do that. And so it's interesting. So you focus on policy, right? And you mentioned the importance of policy. You recognized early on as it relates to how that probably transcends and then trickles down into practice. Yeah. So as you have been engaged in this journey specific to helping leadership, but also focusing on policy, what are you seeing as in terms of the gaps between policy and even sometimes practice?
Well, thank you for sharing the parallels with your journey. I mean, I think there's so many of us that get into education for deeply personal reasons and then realize the power and the potential of the impact that we can have. And especially, I think, for those of us who've done sports, that connection to how you have to really train in so many aspects beyond just the mental part of it and beyond the physical, but also really thinking about the emotional, the spiritual, and bringing that all together. I mean, I think as I think about policy and having worked now for the last 2 decades in so many different efforts to transform policy, I think there's aspects of this that come down to both collective impact, getting people to continuously focus on the same thing is really hard, right? Getting people to really narrow what needs to get done, what needs to change, and to sustain them on those goals is actually so difficult for many leaders to do. And I think what great leaders do is they know how to manage the politics around this. They know how to block their teams from the politics, and they know how to help bring communities along with vision and really to center on that. I think we've seen a lot of efforts around policy in this country that oftentimes just don't even get enough space to really see them through. We start to move on something and then people give up and they change direction. And I think so much, and certainly it's what ILO Group was founded around, is we need great execution. ILO Group stands for In the Life Of. We're a team of practitioners who understand the lives of the leaders that we're working with. We're working with district and state superintendents, governor's offices, and organizations that can have a big impact. And what we see over and over again is great ideas, real struggle on implementation and execution. And so that's where we come in and really help teams to make big bets, big goals, and then to really see those things through.
You also have done some really strategic and important work specific to, what you can call networks, or what we may say leaders helping leaders, and creating this deep sense and system for collaboration. And I don't want to get too much on a soapbox here, but long time ago when I wrote my dissertation, it was on these collaborative systems of educators and the impact that has on student results. And then over time, even though I built a kind of this career soapbox on the importance of teachers working together in tight collaborative systems, what I started to realize is that leaders have the hardest time collaborating of any educator I would imagine. And it's not even their fault, right? It's almost that an expectation is built that when a leader walks into a room, they have to own it. And so over time, they're almost conditioned to not necessarily collaborate, which isn't just discuss and not coordinate. Collaboration is a deep sense of discourse that impacts practice, and you have to be really honest and open, and I think leaders really struggle with that. But you have really leaned into ensuring that happens. And so I'm curious about, when you look at kind of collaboration amongst leaders, what makes confidential leadership networks so essential, but specifically for women and leaders of color?
I think networks are the most important thing that we can pour into. And I think having trusted, confidential networks is the thing that I, for now, almost a dozen years is really where I've been focused. And it came out of my time working for John King as his assistant commissioner. Race to the Top was such a complicated time. And there were both some helpful networks during that time. But more often than not, what I saw is what you were just describing. It was really tough to know what networks you could actually say the truth within. There was always a fear that if you were really honest about how certain things were going politically or with implementation, that could end up backfiring, could create new politics. We all know these things are both, there's an and to all of it, right? Like, it is true new politics could have been created, and it's also true that leaders really do need a space where they are able to take down that heavy burden of leadership and just talk honestly about the political, the operational, the technical, and the fiscal realities of what's going on. When I went to Chiefs for Change, I was charged with building out every piece of the organization. It had just spun off. It was reinventing itself. And one of the first things that we did was to build confidential space for the leaders to come together with very clear rules about that space. We didn't let anyone except for the leaders in that space, no matter what. Lots of times, lots of pressure to let different kinds of people into those spaces. But the absolute rule was this was a superintendent only kind of space. I started to build a reputation with leaders around the country that when I said things, that I really did them and that I always did them. And in fact, at Chiefs for Change, we made sure that we hit 100% of all of our goals that we committed to with philanthropy and with the network. That kind of trust over time meant that I started to build a reputation that when I would convene leaders in these networks, that it could be a space where they could really come together in strong and productive ways and really treat it as strong business meetings where you would have just as much of a focus on your policy work, on your strategy work, on the politics, but also then to have that space to really grow in trust and relationship. What I started to find, though, Jeff, was that the spaces that we were creating were very dominated by men, because the reality of who was in those top leadership roles when you looked around were men. That's what led me years ago, back in 2018, to first create the space that is now Women Leading Ed. We were running a leadership development program, training aspiring district and state superintendents. We had the membership of the network, but it was dominated by men. And even those who were applying for jobs, dominated by men. In fact, when we step back and look at the data, even though our cohorts of aspiring leaders were equal men and women, 83% of the men across the cohorts had applied for at least one district or state superintendency. Only 23% of the women had. And so I teamed up with the late Dr. Lillian Lowry and Hannah Skandera, and I said, I need help. I need to figure out, how do I create a network space that's just for women and predominantly women of color? And how do we create a space that really changes what we're seeing in terms of who's in these rooms, who's advancing policy, who's making these huge decisions for kids? They agreed, and we brought them together. We said we would do one meeting. We would just show the women the data. We would tell them what's going on, and then we would not do it again if they didn't need that kind of space. And what we heard from the women was, first of all, they had no idea that the experience that they were having was a collective experience. They were shocked by the data. They became very competitive about the data. But more importantly, they didn't have any space. No network existed that was doing what we were trying to do to support these women. And so this idea of helping women to grow in their own trust and relationship with one another, to help them to really advance their own impact, but also their collective impact, and to think about the next generation, really took off. Within 2 years, we transformed the network. I was placing more women than men in the superintendent role of districts and states, and our women had now equaled our men in terms of those who were even applying. We ended up at 86% of the network's women who had stepped into the job searches. So completely transformed that network. And so about 4 years ago, I decided to spin off. I realized that there was so much more scale than what we were doing in this small network. We needed to see if we could do this on a larger scale and serve more leaders. And so Women Leading Ed, our national nonprofit network, was born out of that goal. We spun off, we became our own entity in 2021. And since doing so, we now serve women in every state in the country. We have over 500 women in our network. The network are women who are in district and state superintendent roles, and those who are in the C-suite, who are committed to our North Star goal of being the most influential network that there is for women in education leadership, in order to close the gender gap that exists at the top of leadership once and for all. And I'm incredibly proud of where we are as a network and hitting these goals on the growth, but there's so much work to get done if we're going to really get serious about stepping on the gas and closing the gap once and for all.
So, in preparing for this conversation and kind of staying on this vein that you brought up, as I looked into your background and read a variety of research and writings that you've produced, I mean, clearly that you highlight this persistent gender and racial disparities in educational leadership. So, but I'm curious about, let's talk about root causes. So root causes and realities, and maybe what we may miss if we don't truly unpack data and realities of what's occurring. And then, maybe what do we do to help districts or even boards, create a shift and maybe close some of the gaps that are even still there?
So a couple things on the data. First, I just want to underscore this problem has been a problem for a very long time. We now have a data set that we put out publicly. It's called the Superintendent Research Project. Every year we put out the insights and trends around the state of the superintendency. Our data set's now a decade of data, and we've not budged. It's been like the tiniest little budge over the last decade. And in fact, this last year, complete stagnation in the percent. While we are a workforce that's dominated by women, almost 80% of our workforce are women, only 30% of the superintendents across the nation are women. And there is a glaring pay gap, both at the district level and at the state level. Women are paid significantly less than their male counterparts for doing the exact same job. And I see it over and over again. Women are consistently offered packages that are less than their male colleagues. And we have to get real as a society about the invisible work that often still falls traditionally to women. There's so much burden around elder care responsibility at this point, and we just have to acknowledge the way that that's disproportionately hitting women. So you're paying them less, and they have more invisible responsibilities that are impacting them. But when we get to root causes, we've been building out really interesting cuts of the data to explore some different trends, and you can find all of these in our reports. But for example, we've looked at who's getting the top job, like where are you coming from? What we find is that men are much more likely to get into that top superintendent role as the external candidate, meaning no connection to the district. They're being selected because of their propensity to lead. Women, however, far less likely to get into the top role from the external. In fact, what we find is that women, their best shot is when they're the internal candidate. And if they've served as the interim first, nearly half the time the board selects them, which makes sense. Women have to show they can do the job. They have to knock it out of the park. And then they're somehow trusted that they can do the work. This is a huge piece of bias. Men don't have that same kind of bar. We've also looked at things like job titles. What job titles are more likely to land in the superintendency? And I'm sure you will not find this surprising, but the job title that women are most likely to come from is an academic or teaching and learning pathway, and that's just not getting into the top job. You need to have titles like deputy superintendent, chief operating officer, chief of schools, zone superintendents. And what we found as we started to look even more at the data is what I call the skewed pipeline problem. We are fundamentally coaching and mentoring our teaching workforce in really problematic ways. We are telling women over and over again, you're an amazing teacher. You should go be an elementary school principal. Maybe from there, we're telling them you should go be the chief academic officer, or you should go do teaching and learning. Men, on the other hand, are being coached to go into roles like high school principal. High school principal, so much board exposure, community exposure, larger size budgets, capital projects, all of these things that we know matter a ton to boards and are a part of the job descriptions for the superintendency. And so men are getting these up at bats, they're getting more of these opportunities, and they're being coached in different ways. And then from that, many superintendents are coming straight from a high school principal role, or they're going from there to more of those operation heavy roles, the deputy role, the financial roles that then really matter when you're selecting a superintendent. And so for me, as I step back on the root cause, I've come to believe that we have a once in a generation opportunity to completely upskill our teaching workforce and to be incredibly thoughtful about how we are training teachers around finance, around budgets, around operations, around negotiation, skills that matter a lot, whether or not they choose that they want to go into more operational and financial pathways, but to help to give them that opportunity and to give real talk about what the data and the research shows around what pathways to the superintendency really entail.
So this question is actually not to argue that point you just made, because clearly there's a path and a trajectory dilemma you described, right? So early on, we see, according to what you're describing, women are not put on this particular path that aligns them not just to titles, but experience and exposure that lands them in that room where a board offers them, say, a superintendent job. That said, we also know that there are some incredible educational leaders that maybe didn't take that route and maybe are an assistant superintendent on the academic side. But what we're seeing probably, and I'm sure you would agree, is how we hire the superintendents. Right. I mean, how we make the decisions. So it's not just what they've been exposed to, but how boards actually make decisions. And I think that's really important to discuss, because I have worked with hundreds of incredible people, men and women, who you wouldn't be able to check off and say, well, they did this, this, and this. They are ready to be a superintendent. But they may not get the job because of how the hiring process works at the school board level. Can we delve into that a little bit? What recommendations do you have for us, for systems, for boards on their hiring process and decision making?
There is so much bias in these hiring processes, and it's been incredible, this journey that I've been on for the better part of the last decade, up front with so many district and state superintendents in these processes. I've now coached close to 85 leaders into these roles. I mean, it's staggering the way in which bias is so predictable in how it's going to work in these searches. I'll tell you a story about how it plays out in very public ways. We were helping a candidate, Maria Izquierdo, who was going for a job in Sarasota, Florida. And in this search, very public processes in Florida.
Well, it's Florida, so it's sunshine, right, et cetera, yeah.
Exactly. So very public, every single round, and every single round of the process, she's the top pick. She's getting the highest scores. Everyone is really excited about her. And she goes and meets with the board, and she contacts me after. Maria Izquierdo was coming from being Alberto Carvalho's chief academic officer in Miami. So she was that kind of leader who was, really thriving and incredibly successful, had helped to completely turn around that district with Superintendent Carvalho. So she's going for the job, and she tells me that in her board interviews that they started asking her very personal questions about her family and whether people would relocate. Were not focused on her academic chops in any way. And I knew it was a problem, but it was the first time where I'd seen quite so public what we then experienced the next day in the board deliberations. The next day in the board deliberations, so public deliberations, 2 board members begin the comments to go through the selection, talking about how Marie had been their first pick. One referred to her as being delightful, right? The very gendered words we use. Maria is amazing things. I think she's delightful, but certainly if I was describing her, that is not where I would
That's not the first word, yeah.
Brilliant, bold, fearless, incredibly effective. So they refer to her as being delightful, and then they go on to explain, the first board member explains that she's not going to pick her because Marie had shared in her interview that she wouldn't be relocating with her husband and daughter. And the other board member piles on and says, yeah, I mean, how could we trust a superintendent who doesn't move here with their family? These are 2 women board members having this conversation. First of all, not that I should have to explain any of this, but Marie's daughter was a junior in high school. It was the middle of the school year. She was not going to just pick up and move her. And frankly, it was going to be an easy enough commute. But the bigger deal just pulling back is not the facts on any of that. It's the fact that there was not a single man that I've ever coached into the superintendent role who's ever been asked any of these questions. And I could list you a dozen men that I've helped to support that never moved their families with them when they took these roles because of the reality of being able to make it work in a way that worked for their family. And so this idea that women get held to a different standard, this idea that somehow leadership has these different qualities around whether someone can be a parent and a leader and their level of effectiveness is just all about bias, frankly. And we have to do better and more in these search processes to make sure that we are not holding women to a different standard than we hold men, and to just acknowledge that bias exists, and we've got to do much more in these hiring processes to mitigate it. And honestly, that's just one example of so many of the way this plays out. That one just happens to be very public. You can read my piece in the 74 about it, where we have the video linked. It's incredible.
So I know my next question, but before I ask this, and I'm ready and excited to ask it, I'm going to kick this back to Chris. Chris has some very specific words for us. So, ladies and gentlemen, hold on. And our fearless producer, Chris.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Richard, and I'm the producer of the Leader Chat with Jeff Rose podcast, brought to you by Cognia. Just a quick reminder, if you haven't done so already, please make sure you follow or subscribe to us if you're listening to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, or Podbean, to make sure you're getting all the latest updates on the newest episodes. You can also check out our video episodes under our Cognia YouTube channel. Please make sure you check those out and leave us a like or a comment and let us know how we're doing. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. Back to you, Jeff.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, so now this is something you and I have talked about when we were preparing. And by the way, I think 80% of leader chats in some way, shape, or form start to talk about what we're all experiencing as it relates to leaders and the expectations for them to know how to and strategically zig and zag politically in the work. And it's not necessarily part of, principal school, superintendent school. It just becomes an expectation of knowing how to navigate this incredibly complex and nuanced world of politics seeping into education in a way that was not the case 10 and 20 and 30 years ago. It's always been part of the work, I can promise you that, but nothing like it is today. That being the case, how do political dynamics uniquely challenge women, and especially women of color, differently, potentially? And then how are you helping them with such a complicated work?
Look, I think the politics for everyone have become so much more complicated. I mean, the politics were always there, right? It's not like that aspect has changed. I think what has changed, though, is both the rapid cycle of social media that exists around it. I think there is just more of a sense of things being recorded and being put out there in ways that are getting disseminated faster. I'm particularly concerned about deepfakes as we move into this world of AI and the impact that that can have for leaders and for our democracy, as well as all of the politics around that. I think what feels really different, and we certainly saw this during COVID, is I think for many communities, women, and particularly women of color, became the sponge for so much the vitriol and the emotion that people were going through. So much of the work that I do on behalf of our network is just helping to share stories that women can't always tell, whether it's stories that they can't tell because when they exit, they sign packages on it. It's whether it's stories that they can't tell because they can't be the ones to point these things out. But I help the media to see things in board meetings where, for example, one of the women that I work with during a public board meeting was told by her board members to fix her face. I mean, these things are just incredible what happens for these women. And so being able to help to point these things out and to just acknowledge the way in which social media and our inability to really pause and slow down these days before taking action is just having incredible impact on superintendents. The way we see it play out is we've been seeing a carousel of leadership in the superintendency since the start of COVID. As part of the trends we've put out, we've shown that there are historic levels of turnover. And even this past year, it still hadn't slowed down. We were still at 20% of the top 500 largest districts that had turned over at least once. Usually the statistics are around 14 to 16%. And so we're seeing the way that this level of the politics is having a massive impact on the state of the superintendency and then at every level within the system. Part of we provide to our network is 24/7 crisis support so that no woman is ever alone in this. We help to create network effect. When women are going through something, we help to pair them up with other strong women who are particularly strong on the politics. And our ultimate promise to all of the women in our network is you are never alone. If you are going to take this big job and you are going to do really hard stuff for kids, then we will be there for you every single day. And I put my personal word and my own personal credibility into that.
So whether it be, the political side of the work, there are these other skill sets and expectations that come with leadership that sometimes we forget to train and prepare leaders for. So what we're seeing now is, as you know, we're at an all-time high in terms of our inexperience, right? So right now we have the least experienced leader force that we've seen in this country, and we know that is going to continue to change over time. You mentioned when we talk about politics, but the other one that you have talked about is these negotiation skills. Mm-hmm. And I think that's important to bring up because I can remember the first time I was truly asked to negotiate things in my first district leadership position, and I had never done that before. But for some reason, it was an expectation that I would be negotiating this particular contract, which, by the way, had huge implications for thousands of people as well as millions and millions of dollars. And that wasn't just negotiation of my own contract. That was just negotiating skills and strategies. And we just expect that. So that being the case, you've written around the importance of, these negotiation skills. Can you talk to that to help us not just understand what's reality, but maybe what's important?
Yeah. So every year, Women Leading Ed does an insight survey, and we take a look at what hundreds of women across the country have on their mind, and really try to use that to drive a lot of the strategy and just kind of figure out where the pulse is for women leaders. I was pretty surprised last year by some of the overwhelming trends. One of them in particular was that nearly the entire network of women had said that they were never trained on negotiation. It was the highest statistic in that survey. It was like nearly 9 in 10 women who said they'd never been trained in negotiation. And they talked about how it was holding them back in both big ways and small ways. Really, you have to negotiate every single day, whether it's just in getting your way on things that you need to get your way on, but also just in how you deal with so many of the politics, let alone big contract negotiations like what you shared. I also started to hear trends back from some of our partners who would call me and say, hey, I just met with one of the women in your network and she didn't negotiate with me. She just took the contract. You got to talk to her. And I was like, all right, I'm hearing this way too often.
Okay.
So I stepped back and I was like, okay, we need to think about this creatively. This is not going to be one of those moments where just giving everybody some upskill course in negotiation is going to do the trick. We really need to step back and think about how do we make this really stick and be really practical. So I happened to read this Time magazine article about Jenny Just. Jenny Just is this self-made billionaire who started an organization called Poker Power because what she thought that was holding women back in fintech is that they didn't know how to play poker, and that was causing them to not know how to negotiate. So she thought that if we could train up women around the skills of poker, that we could then get them better armed for negotiation. Well, I just say it totally resonated with me. When I was at the University of Cambridge doing my PhD, I was the only woman in the graduate union poker society. And I had the experience.
Wait, back up. Say it again.
Yeah.
You were in the what poker society?
The Graduate Union Poker Society. So Cambridge University in England has its own for all the graduate students. They have a poker society because, of course, it's England. Why would you not? And I decided that I was going to walk into this place, and I was the only woman that was there when I walked in. And so I had just this incredible experience of being in this all male world and getting to see how I fared in it. And I fared quite well. I learned to feel really comfortable in an all male environment. I learned when it was really important to bluff, when it was important to play my hand. And most importantly, I really understood the importance of thinking in probability and really assessing risk in different ways. So when I read Jenny's piece, I was like, oh, this totally resonates. I totally get it. And so I did what I think you've now heard in this. I tend to feel really comfortable cold emailing big leaders. And so I decided to send a cold email to Jenny Just, telling her how much her story resonated with me and inviting her to come to last year's Women Leading Ed Summit. The craziest part is that she accepted and she ended up coming to our summit. I got to do this incredible fireside chat where we got to really learn from her and about the way she thinks about all of this and about negotiation. And then we had Poker Power train our women in the art of negotiation. And it's really been a powerful part of what we do. It is just learning about negotiation through the principles of poker and being able to help that really stick. I have heard from so many women in our network about how helpful this continues to be for them in their ability to know when to walk away, when they know that the other person is bluffing. And I hear this all the time in how much more comfortable they are talking to other people about negotiation because we've given them a different lens and framework. And ultimately, that's what I'm trying to do with Women Leading Ed. I'm trying to take a problem that has felt intractable and just approach it with new kinds of solutions and new ways of looking and thinking about things.
So it won't take long before we're going to start hearing from members and listeners on our next leader chat, right? Specific to we need to lean into poker. We need to have some people that's fascinating and it makes sense. And I never would have thought of that. So, and by the way,
one of our next steps from all this is we can organize a joint poker night.
Yeah, it's an impressive idea, right? Because you're absolutely right, and I would never play poker with you at this point, but having played before, you're 100% correct, and there's some probably incredible transferable skills that we ignore based upon, once again, experience, you being the only woman in that room, but those skills translate to certain things that some people are probably either denied or never invited into. So that's amazing. So let's also now an interesting shift from that to something I know too that's important to you, which is kind of AI and education. And we've had several really, really incredible guests specific to AI and what we can start to expect, what's actually current, because there's many educators, and this is not their fault, that are not aware of what tools are either at their fingertips or what they need to be prepared for as it relates to how kids are often ahead of us. And so as it relates to AI, specific to educational leadership, what are some of the trends that you think are really important we start to pay attention to? And then how do we lean in as opposed to run from?
Well, look, I'm incredibly excited about AI. I think this is a really exciting time where being able to really think about how you leverage a tool that has so much potential to make your life easier, like just on a personal level, being able to use AI to help to make your work easier, to figure out ways to think more creatively and to really just have someone beyond yourself that can get some of your more routine tasks done. I think for just everyone society-wise is a really exciting part of AI. I think for education leaders, though, especially as somebody who has now been working in this space for 2 decades, I watched so many of the bumps across personalized learning. I watched so many bumps across different approaches to data integrations, attempts at interoperability, cybersecurity issues. So I have been just taking a very cautious approach with AI, and certainly with the leaders we work with, to start with really thinking about risk mitigation and how to make the most of this opportunity by being really thoughtful about the political, the operational, the technical, and the fiscal realities of what has to get done for AI to be harnessed effectively. We've been running a working group with 40 different districts and states, and I'm committed to putting out what we're learning as rapidly as possible. We've released 2 frameworks. We have a new division, AILO, that we've launched that really helps superintendents of districts and states and their teams to really make sense of how to think about decision making. In mid-January, we'll be putting out a GBT that we've built that is an AI support. It essentially takes our frameworks, the way that we think about strategy and implementation, and allows you and your team to have your own free supports, your own coach, as you're thinking about AI. From my perspective, all communities should be in a very deep community engagement process, thinking about digital literacy and then AI literacy across your entire system before you start layering on any kinds of products or software. I also think we've got to make sure that we have our house in order when it comes to the tech side. If you do not have your cybersecurity, your data integration, and your data systems in a place that are shored up, then you should not be layering AI on right now. That is just too much risk for your system. And so being able to just be really thoughtful and helping people to recognize that there's no first mover advantage right now. No one is out in front. Everyone's figuring it out. There's no unicorn consultant that's going to help you to solve all your AI needs. It really is just a thoughtful process that really needs to center values that you have as a community, and also recognizing just how deep the challenges have been around cell phones and social media, and really thinking about how to avoid this becoming worse for kids. And I think starting with the problems adults are recognizing for their own work is one avenue in. I think spending time with students and with caregivers in your community to understand what problems they think can get solved, I think those are the ways that you want to start on all of this.
And I am not in. I'm fully agreeing with what you're saying. The one thing that, and I'm thinking out loud here, the one thing I worry about, because I think you are right as it relates to our needs as systems to think about the appropriate safeguards and infrastructure to be able to kind of lean in effectively and systemically. My worry is that we don't maybe go fast enough or take enough risks. And I think that, we have to be careful because, we have lives in our hands. I think though in education, we sometimes deservingly struggle with speed of change. Mm-hmm. And my worry is that we're so careful that eventually if we don't make some of these changes that are right there at our fingertips, they will just get made for us. Mm. And so if we don't open our doors and maybe even take some level of risks in terms of what this can do as it relates to personalized learning. I mean, the wonderful opportunity for personalized learning, because we've been talking about that for decades too, but knowing how to do it and support the educator, the teacher in that work is sometimes really cumbersome. But here we are with some really interesting opportunities. So the speed and risk, I just think is a topic we need to discuss maybe differently in education than we have in the past. Does that make sense?
No, I agree with you. I think, I guess I sort of see this as a sort of multiple moment of stepping back and asking, what are we going to do once and for all to get problems that we know exist within our systems, problems where AI can be a really effective solution, and put our energy to getting those done while we're trying to pilot and better understand how these tools really are impacting what we all have always hoped and wanted around personalized learning. I think especially for those of us who have had our own experiences in special education, this idea that every student could have their own IEP and that it would be a great IEP that would help all students to be able to get their individualized supports and to be seen and understood by anyone who is going to be supporting them. It's amazing. Except if we still have this problem where we can't even get great educators into our systems, because we have so much bureaucracy around rules and understanding about certification and reciprocity, and how do you get into a system, and what in your transcript you're missing in order to get into our workforce. Like, those are problems I'm excited about AI solving. And we're certainly seeing that in some of the states that we're working with, where they've decided to really take AI and solve these issues around workforce, to say, okay, if we're going to move student outcomes, and if this is going to be the most important priority, well, then the most important person is that teacher in front of them. So how do we make it easier to become a teacher and to understand how to become a teacher? Let's build an AI feature, takes our regulations, takes all of our guidance documents, it takes all the rules, and allows individuals to access information faster, quicker, and then with more personalized information about what they have to do. I love solutions like that. To me, that will get us to the spirit of what you're describing, with an and that we also need to be able to pilot things. And what I love about these LLMs, there was a study that came out in August from some researchers out of Stanford and NYU who were able to really create and replicate really low cost experiments and pilot experiments, and to do so very effectively. That kind of stuff makes me really excited about AI, because we know if we're going to pilot stuff, we need to have rigorous pilots in place. And we know that that's often the last thing that teams have resources to be able to do, and to do well and quickly and enough that it informs decision making. So I'm really excited about sort of the and of what the spirit of what you said. Yes, let's get to real personalized learning. Let's get to a place of IEPs for all as just a norm. And let's do so thinking about the way that AI can help us to think about rapid, low-cost experiments and research, and solving the massive system problems that are ultimately impacting all of this, because we're not able to get great teachers into our systems as easily as we should be able to.
I left my last superintendency in 2019. And looking back, especially now that I learned vicariously through so many other leaders throughout the country and beyond, one thing I can recognize is that my strategies back then, even the effective ones, may not be as effective in this day and age, right? So I'm even sometimes hesitant to do these very specific coaching opportunities, because I think, look, I led before COVID. Things have shifted and changed dramatically. And as you've helped so many leaders get to these leadership roles, and then help them as they're in it through the networking as well as policy work that you do, what are you seeing are the effective strategies for now? Not just but for now, that help a leader really engage in meaningful and lasting changes in their district?
Well, first, we've got to sustain these leaders for the long run. And so a ton of my own coaching practice when I'm hired by leaders to work with them is a big focus around wellness, around how they're using their time. I do a lot of work with them on the analysis of their time versus the goals that they have, helping them to really reset the way that they're using time, but also to think about wellness and their physical, their mental, their emotional, their spiritual, all as a part of their core practice. Sometimes I think we act as though superintendents are just going to always be in this 24/7 kind of crisis response. And look, it's true, these jobs are 24/7, but you've also got to create the boundaries within your schedule so that you have all of your big rocks in place. And so for me, it's a huge focus around helping to sustain these leaders for the long run. I just this morning had a coaching call with a woman that I helped to coach into her role. I've now been coaching her for the last 3 years, and she's gotten really serious about her wellness practice. And we're now really dialing it up, looking at things like her VO2 max score and looking at body scans to really think about skeletal muscle. And I think these are the parts of leadership that we just don't talk enough about, that if you're going to get to a place where you feel great, you've got to be really thinking about these metrics. And for women in particular, by the time you're in your 40s, if you're just starting to worry about things like your muscle mass, we got a lot more work to do, because it's going to be a lot harder.
You know, the one thing that we say often is that we believe too that the best form of professional development is leaders helping leaders, right? Our motto is something we stole from a line from my pastor says, which is circles are better than rows. Mm. So if you were to imagine, and this is kind of the way this is our traditional final question of our esteemed guests, if we were around a table and with us are principals, superintendents, and everything in between, and we're having this discussion, but it's coming to a close, what would be your final kind of drop the mic words of advice for them? I mean, this is a kind of elevator speech, 30 seconds. What would you say to them if we had them around a table? Ready, go.
The first thing is that the role of the superintendent, whether it's of a district or a state, is the best job in the world. You have the power and the potential to make more impact than you could ever imagine on kids. But the reality of these jobs is it requires battle-tested, fearless leaders who are there to advance student outcomes. And as you're thinking about everything that you're doing in your career, what are you doing to wake up every single day to do more and better for the students that you're serving? And for women, the thing that I would say to you is you are ready. We know that women are more likely to hold themselves back from career opportunities, to stay longer at every single career rung as compared to your male counterparts. So step forward, step into it, but be relentlessly focused on your student outcomes and recognize that the work ahead is some of the most important work that you can be doing. And to be in that work, we got to sustain you for the long run. And that's what Women Leading Ed is here to do.
Julia, of course, I appreciate this time that we've had. I mean, this is for me, like I said at the very beginning, I just learned so much from our guests. But I want to thank you not just for this, but kind of for what you're doing in the field, right? I worry a lot about educational leaders and leadership. I mean, I have anxiety about that because I think that they're so important, and sometimes their needs, they kind of go last. Even they put their own needs last. Out of this, heart to serve, they do so. And so what you're doing as it relates to these networking opportunities, this advocacy, this coaching, as well as focusing on policy, I just think you're doing you're dropping an incredible large rock into the pond. And I just want you to know that I really, really appreciate what you're doing.
I really appreciate that. Thank you. And thanks for the opportunity to share our work on here.
Of course. All right. Thanks again. Be well.
Thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think that if of course you could start with the end in mind and listen very specifically to, kind of Julia's last words of advice, but I think it's really, really important that as you listen, you almost pause and think about the very strong messages and data that she's describing, because there are some issues that are persistent and we complain about and talk about often, but what are we doing about them is the most important discussion. So I'm so thankful to watch a leader like Julia and the organization that she has created actually creating action in the field of educational leadership. I want to remind everyone to listen, subscribe, and follow to our show. Ladies and gentlemen, educators, leaders, be well.